Everybody, that my interview with Ambassador O'Brien, President Trump's national security advisor, occurred about a week ago. I hear the sound is great, the visuals are a little wobbly, so it'll be a nice thing to listen to. Let's hear the interview. I'm pleased to welcome Ambassador Robert O'Brien, who is the 27th National Security Advisor to a President of the United States. Ambassador O'Brien, it's really great to welcome you again to the annual Global Security Forum in Doha, and I really appreciate the time to talk with me a bit about how you see America's national security and foreign policy equities in the world. So great to see you. And let me just open for a minute and say, right now, how do you think America is doing in pursuing its foreign policy interests in the world? What would be, the things you would applaud, and what would the things you would criticize?
Well, we're in a very dangerous time, Steve, and thanks for having me. And it's great to be back in Doha, at least virtually. Got a lot of good friends in Qatar, and wish everyone well. Look, we've got a very dangerous situation in the world right now. I've said it's probably the most dangerous we've seen since 1938. And we've got a war in Russia and Ukraine, a war of conquest, which we haven't seen for many years. We saw certainly Iraq try and conquer Kuwait, and the Argentines try and conquer the Falkland Islands. But both of those were repelled. So we're waiting to see how this ends up. But it would be the first time borders would be changed by conquest in Europe since 1938. So a very dangerous situation in Europe. And then we've got the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits. We actually have a very hot situation right now with China literally stripping away the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines and taking Philippine islands and features and atolls and squeezing the Philippines. And at the same time, threatening to coerce Taiwan, which, keep in mind, Steve, has never been governed by the Communist Party of China, never been governed by these, trying to coerce them into a unification that they don't want. They're a democratic people. They're a free people. They don't want to be ruled by Beijing. And, we've got threats of invasion by 2027. Xi Jinping has told his military to get ready to attack and invade in Normandy style Taiwan. But look, they've got all kinds of other tools of coercion they could use, blockades and cyber attacks and gray zone tactics that we've seen the Russians use. And then, of course, we've got what's going on in the region with Iran becoming a regional hegemon, totally unleashed since the Trump administration. Iran was in a box, had very little money, couldn't pay the salaries of the Hezbollah proxies. And now Iran is one of the richest countries in the world because of sanctions relief that the Biden administration has given them and got nothing in return. So it's a dangerous time. America looks weak. And what I used to always tell my staff when we had our staff meetings, I think they got sick of this. I said, look, weakness is provocative. And even the perception of American weakness is provocative. So fundamentally, America is not a weak country. We're as strong as we always have been, with the great natural resources and the great innovative people and the strong military and the diplomatic and cultural power. But we appear weak to our adversaries, and so they're using that perceived weakness to take advantage in the world. And that's bad, not just for America, but it's bad for our allies. It's bad for Ukraine.
Right.
It's bad for
Let me ask you a question. I mean, you're cleared, so you know the nation's top secrets. You saw them every day in the White House. They were funneling into you. You interacted with President Trump about them. I don't want to know the secrets, but I do want to know what you think the quality of our intelligence is when it comes to understanding Xi Jinping's decision-making, his goals, where he wants to go. And do we have a good fix on that, from across the government, U.S. government, national security perspective, that he is, from your best assessment, really geared towards not just a confrontational track with Taiwan, which you've just referenced, but broadly with American interests? How do you see Xi Jinping and what we know about what he really wants to do?
Yeah, Steve, thank you. And look, the United States has exquisite intelligence collection measures that we can take, but we don't need that with Xi Jinping. He's been very open, especially in the Chinese media and Chinese press and in Communist Party bulletins. He's an unrepentant Marxist-Leninist. He feels the fall of the Soviet Union, like Vladimir Putin, was a disgrace, not because the Russian Empire was lost. That he doesn't really care about that. In fact, I think he's got eyes on Russia. I mean, something I told General Patrushev in my last summit in Geneva in September of 2020, that China's coming for you, just like they came for Hong Kong and Macau and Taiwan and going after Indian land. Russia has massive tracts of land that was taken from the Chinese and under the 1860 Treaty of Peking, Convention of Peking. And
Right.
so the Chinese are coming for the Russians eventually. But the reason Xi Jinping was so disappointed by the fall of the Soviet Union is that it was Marxist-Leninism was destroyed in big parts of the world. And so we know what he wants. He wants a Marxist-Leninist world with Chinese characteristics. And the Chinese characteristics are very simple. China's at the middle of the middle kingdom, the center of the world. Everyone pays tribute to the Chinese. They might let you have some freedom and some sovereignty here and there if it fits their interests, but he's the boss, and he's going to do everything it takes using diplomatic tools, military tools, economic tools to achieve his goals. And he's doing it across the Pacific and the South Island. They see it in the Solomons today. We saw the attacks on India several years ago on the Indian patrols in the Himalayas. So you don't need top secret information to know what Xi Jinping wants. You just have to listen to him and take him seriously.
So President Trump, when he was in office, had days where he actually talked about Xi Jinping's strengths and his relationship, his ability to communicate, but he was also very tough on him, imposed a lot of sanctions, which we actually now see the Biden administration has reviewed and is even, toughening up some of President Trump's sanctions. I guess the question here is, how do you see President Trump engaging with China if the Trump administration were to come back, given a reality, which just got to put it on the table, we have $750 billion of bilateral trade around that number, but between China and the United States. So that's, hard to wish away. But how would you deal with something in which there's such serious degrees of confrontation brewing, but yet it's part of the economic lifeline for a lot of Americans?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the one thing I'll say about President Trump and Xi or Putin is he was always or Kim Jong-un, he was always very cordial with him in his personal conversations. And you want that with world leaders. You want people to be civilized and diplomatic in their conversations. But you need to look at the actions. And you pointed out, we did this with Russia, we did it with China, we did it with Iran. Very strong sanctions, very strong economic measures to try and keep them in a box and use those tools of American power to avoid war. That strength, showing American resolve and strength and determination, counterintuitively, it doesn't encourage aggression. It deters aggression, and it leads to peace. And that's the whole idea of peace through strength is the fruits of strength are peace. It's not so that we can have an international bragging competition of who's got the most satellites or who's got the most ICBMs or who's got the most fighter jets. The reason you have those platforms is to guarantee peace. And what I think what President Trump was happy to talk about and brag about was the fact that we had no new wars under his administration for the first time since Jimmy Carter. We had the Abraham Accords. We had healed the Gulf Rift between Qatar and its Arab allies. We had economic normalization between Serbia and Kosovo. Look, we even got a peace deal with the Taliban that was screwed up when we left office and we had a catastrophic withdrawal. But the fruits of it is strength. So going back to your question about China, the idea of being tough on China and lessening our dependence on rare earths and batteries and EVs and that sort of thing is not to let China fulfill its dream of the Beijing/China 2025 policy, where China is a manufacturer of the world and everyone has to come to China for the needs that it has. And so if we can bring the economies back to ourselves, but not just to ourselves, to our friends and neighbors and like-minded partners, even in the region, even in Vietnam and Taiwan and India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, and have trusted providers and trusted supply chains, that's good for us. It's good for the free world, and it also kind of keeps China from dominating the world with their toxic ideology.
I want our audience to know something. That is that there's a lot of speculation out in the Washington scene and around the country of those people who watch foreign policy that you are one of the very few that I would call it Trump land, who helped guide the president, who interact with the president, who are part of that higher end world shaping what might be the future of U.S. foreign policy under a next President Trump term, if you were to be reelected. I'm really interested, Robert, and you and I know each other well, in what you would think the distinctive features of a GOP return to the helm, to the White House, would look like. What would be the measures you would move? Because I'm guessing that you've got a pretty good chance to be Secretary of State, to be National Security Advisor again, to be in that, I don't know which job you might want if this comes in, and what job the president might give you. But it is interesting that you're in that mix. So what can you share with us about what matters most to the GOP in foreign policy if you were to come back?
Well, like the president will pick his team, and there's a lot of great people like John Radcliffe and Mike Pompeo and Rick Grenell and Senator Hagerty and just a long list of great people. And I just want to see.
I had just was with Senator Hagerty the other night, and also Tom Cotton, and there's some others in there, but they all speak highly of you.
Well, that's kind of them, and you know they're great guys and gals, and Marshall Blackburn and Joni Ernst. So they're just a lot of wonderful people that want to serve. And I think one of the fallacies of the liberal media in America is that they're not people that want to serve in the Trump administration, that they're not high quality. President Trump's going to have a first-class team, and of course, I'd salute and say yes to anything he asked me to do. But I just want to see President Trump get elected and return to peace or strength. And I think that the fundamental thing, Steve, is to rebuild our defense industrial base. I mean, we're seeing in Ukraine, we're seeing with the stress of the conflict in Israel and Gaza, and trying to supply our friends in Taiwan. America does not have the industrial base it used to. This isn't World War II where things go wrong and we can start converting GM plants and Ford plants into aircraft manufacturing plants overnight. Mm-hmm. That world doesn't exist anymore. The platforms that we build are too complicated for the most part, and we can do it, but it takes years. And so we've got to get our defense industrial base, starting with the shipyards, rebuilt. That's going to take investment, and so unfortunately, we had this huge infrastructure bill in America, $1 trillion. Not one dime of it went to shipyards in America. The Chinese are 200 times the number of ships we are. 200 times. I mean, that's orders of magnitude more than us. We can't stay a serious power if that's the case. And so we've got to rebuild our defense industrial base, just like we did the CHIPS Act with the semiconductors. We've got to do something very similar for ships. We've got to do it with planes. We've got to do it with artillery shells, which are pretty basic technology. We've got to process rare earths. So all these platforms, and not just military, but civilian, rely on rare earth elements. We can mine them in America. We've got them, but we have no processing plant. So even if we mine them here at the Mountain Pass mine in California, where I'm from, you have to send them to China to be processed. So our adversary controls key elements of our supply chain. So I think bringing that back and rebuild our military that's the foundation of peace or strength. But then from there, it's protecting American strength and being confident in our vision. Let's go back to a battle of ideas. I mean, you remember the Reagan administration. We're old enough, Steve, and a lot of people watching probably aren't. But Reagan and Bush and even Clinton, and they met with dissidents, Sharansky, and we held up a beacon of liberty to the folks who are oppressed in these places. Who's calling on China to release Jimmy Lai now? Why isn't Jimmy Lai signed with President Biden? I mean, we need to get back to a battle of ideas with the communists, with the red Chinese, and
so are you saying that Donald Trump would say that Jimmy Lai matters, and what are you doing? Release Jimmy Lai and begin elevating some of these prisoners of conscience around the world?
I think we did. We sanctioned the Hong Kong government. We're the first American government ever to do that. But we also, and Mike Pompeo was critical in this, working with President Trump and myself at the end of the administration, we designated China as committing genocide against the Uyghurs. I mean, we're speaking out in a Muslim country in Islam, at the kind of the heart of Islam in the Persian Gulf. Where is the outrage against China for what they're doing, a cultural and religious genocide against the Uyghurs?
Right.
No one for the Uyghurs.
Well, I follow a lot of this, and I empathize and actually sympathize with a lot of it. Where I find myself confused sometimes by the signals from President Trump, or when it comes to Russia and Ukraine and the conflict there, where NATO, our transatlantic allies, are engaged in the struggle, and I can't tell you sometimes which side I think Trump is on, given his direction. So when it comes to these issues, as you just talked about, Solzhenitsyn and Reagan, Morning in America, embracing this, a human rights driven national security and foreign policy that was strong. How does that fit with the Ukraine-Russia model? What would you advise Trump to do in this? And how can you tell me what Donald Trump really thinks about Vladimir Putin and Russia today?
Well, look, when I gave a speech at CPAC a couple of years ago, right before the invasion, I called President Trump. I said, look, I'm going to call Putin a thug in my speech. I'm going to decry what Russia's doing. But I'm also going
Right.
to say that there's no deterrence taking place. And Joe Biden was talking about a minor incursion, that if Putin just had a minor incursion into Ukraine, that would be okay. What kind of green light is that for a dictator? It's like, just take Sudetenland and take just a little piece of Czechoslovakia and we'll all be happy, we'll have peace in our time. That's a sort of, that's how that's read. And I think
So I just want our audience to know that you're talking about a speech that President Biden gave that basically did outline where it might be geographically tolerable for, because this is a very important point you're making, because I remember the speech very well and was surprised. So maybe you could go into that just a moment, because I want our audience not to lose that.
Sure. So rather than deterring Russia and saying, don't take a step into Ukraine, further into Ukraine, don't attack Ukraine, President Biden said, well, if there was a minor incursion by Russia into Ukraine, that might be acceptable to the United States. Well, when you give a green light like that to a dictator, if you give them a pinky, they're going to take the whole land. And that's what Vladimir Putin do. And keep in mind, he did this on the heels, Steve, of watching us abandon our allies in Afghanistan. And the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan left Americans behind, left our allies behind. And we almost saw a replay of it in Ukraine, because the first impulse of the Biden administration was to offer Volodymyr Zelensky a plane ride or a helicopter.
But just on the Afghanistan thing, wasn't President Trump planning to leave anyway? Weren't they both wasn't the end result going to be the same? Where am I wrong on that? Because you had negotiated a departure date. Yeah,
as you recall, we had conditions based and we made that very clear to the Taliban. They wouldn't have dared to done what they did. They didn't kill one American soldier during the time we were in office after we signed the deal. And they knew they had to come up with a deal with the Afghan government. And we weren't going to just have a Saigon-style withdrawal of Afghanistan. There were some people that wanted that, but the president didn't want that. President Trump didn't want that. I didn't want that. Mike Pompeo didn't want it. Chris Miller, acting executive, didn't want that. And it didn't happen. And we were looking for a real deal between the government and the Taliban to have a transitional government, a government of national unity, one in which people's rights were protected. People that wanted to come to America, our translators, our interpreters, our friends, or the pilots in the Afghan Air Force that wanted to come to America, that they could get out and come, that America would still be there engaged diplomatically. Keep in mind, we had 5,000 NATO troops and 2,500 U.S. troops there the day we left office. And there was relative peace in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan's never been peaceful. I'm not saying it was Sweden, but it was in pretty good shape when we left office. That deteriorated. And Vladimir Putin watched it and said, this is my opportunity to take Ukraine. And fortunately, Zelensky, unlike President Ghani, didn't hop on a helicopter and leave. He stayed and fought like hell. And we all owe the West and free people owe him a debt of gratitude, and the Ukrainian people a debt of gratitude. But Steve, what did he use in those first few days, in those critical days when that three-pronged armored attack, three-axis armored attack was coming at Kharkiv and Kiev and Odessa? He used the Javelin missiles that President Trump gave him, the 600 Javelins. We were the first people to give the lethal aid to the Ukrainians. I was involved in it. Unfortunately, our Office of Secretary of Defense tells a different story now, but at the time they were opposed to it because, like by the Biden administration today, they didn't want to escalate and they didn't want to, quote, provoke Putin. Well, Putin's already been provoked. Unfortunately, we steamrolled him, and the president got those javelins to Ukraine. And just recently, the foreign minister of Ukraine again thanked President Trump and said if it hadn't been for those javelins, it would have been over before it started. Now, I will give the Biden folks credit because they've gotten aid and equipment, material, and platforms since then. It's always been too little, too late. And they also didn't lean on our European allies. That's one thing President Trump wasn't bashful about. When we stopped Nord Stream 2 in its tracks, the first thing the Biden administration did when they came in was they opened Nord Stream 2. Well, what kind of message was that to the Russians? You can have Europe, you can make them your energy vassals. And at the same time, we opened up Nord Stream 2. We closed the Keystone Pipeline, which we were about 900,000 barrels a day of Canadian oil to be refined cleanly in America under EPA guidance here. So we shut down our own oil supply, opened up the Russian oil supply, and that was a clear message to Vladimir Putin that he's free to do whatever he wants.
So what I'm hearing from you, Robert, is really, really interesting because there is a divide, very clear and evident divide in the GOP on Russia, in my view. You've got folks like Tucker Carlson out there. I would call him on the dovish wing of engaging and dealing with Russia. You're very much outlining a more hawkish and a tougher more consistent lines, sending more consistent signals, and you're critical of the Biden administration for sending mixed signals on that and giving essentially a green light or incentives to Putin. But you're defining something that's quite different. I'm really interested when a president comes in, a national security advisor, how do you surf these tensions? Because you're drawing something that we're going to be tough on Putin, but there are big parts of the Republican Party that said they don't see Russia in the same way as a threat. And I'd also say, candidly, that when President Trump, if he does come back and does win this coming election, that will be a controversial thing domestically. How do you begin to, as an advisor to the president in whatever role you may have, outside government, inside government, figure out how you begin surfing these incredibly different tectonic divides on perspective?
No, that's a good question, Steve. And I think that the key is with Russia, you've got to bring Ukraine and Russia to the table, right? I mean, every war ends around the table. World War II ended around the table on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. It was an unconditional surrender, but it's still around the table with people signing documents. We've got to figure out how to get the Russians to the table. And I think to do that is to be strong with the Russians, put real sanctions on them. That'll encourage Vladimir Putin to come to the table. And we've obviously got a lot of leverage with Zelensky and the Ukrainians. Part of it's to get the Europeans to pay their fair share, which they always shirk, especially the Germans, and get them to burden share with us and guarantee real security for the Ukrainians going forward. Mm-hmm. But you need to bring the Russians to the table through hard measures, hard sanctions, secondary sanctions on the oil market. Stop making a huge profit on this war. Take the profit away, and then with the Ukrainians, you got to give them security guarantees so that they feel comfortable working out a deal with the Russians. That's how you bridge the gap. But keep in mind with Russia, look, Russia's the aggressor here. They're in the wrong. Mm-hmm. It's a brutal, tyrannical regime. But Russia has a role to play in the world, and we've got to respect that. They've got a lot of nuclear weapons pointed at us. And Russia also is not a natural ally of China. Russia and China together is very dangerous to the United States. This unlimited that Putin has formed with Xi is very dangerous for the West and the United States. We need to figure out a way to try and bring Russia back, try and drive a wedge between China and Russia, which should be relatively easy to do since Xi Jinping has said he wants to take half of Russia. He wants all of Siberia. He wants all their oil wealth and their minerals and that sort of thing. And, the Russians are pretty tough people. I don't see the Russians giving up to the Chinese and letting them take over Siberia. But we need to break up that alliance. We need to get the Russians back to understand that they can't have Europe by conquest. They can't reassemble the Russian Empire by conquest. And once we do that, we can have good relations with Russia. There's no reason we can't have good relations with Russia. And frankly, Steve, we can have good relations with China. But we can't have good relations with China while they're stealing our intellectual property. Christopher Wray called it the biggest transfer of wealth in human history. I mean,
Christopher Wray, the FBI director, I should tell our audience, the FBI director, right?
Director said the biggest transfer of wealth in human history has been the theft by China of U.S. intellectual property.
Which we've been seeing and talking about for decades.
30 years.
It's just been exactly. So it's been going on for quite a long time. So I take that point, but let me just jump in here, Ambassador. I'm going to make life tough for you here for a minute. I'm going to say you are hereby anointed as, Secretary of State, one of the key players of a potentially returning Trump administration. October 7th has happened. 1,200 Israelis have been slaughtered and murdered. Hundreds of hostages have been taken. But after a few months, we've also seen tens of thousands of Palestinians, many women and children who were innocent of this conflict, killed in the response. Fix it. How would you fix it? How would you approach it? What would be the Trump administration's approach to Gaza and Israel that we're not seeing today from the Biden administration?
Well, I don't want to speak for President Trump and what he'd do if he returned, but I'll tell you what my thoughts are, and I said this on day one. This was an attack on Israel. It was brutal, and it was like this wasn't even terrorism. This attack gave terrorism a bad name. I mean, these guys were serial killers. The kind of atrocities they committed. We didn't even see it at the height of ISIS. I mean, this was sick people, more like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, American serial killers that you read about in the horror movies or in horror books. Than even this isn't old style Palestinian hijacking aircraft or killing Israeli. Not that those were acceptable, but this was the six are killing parents in front of the children, killing children in front of the parents. Very, very, very bad. And in the old days when Palestinian terrorists killed Americans, and there were Americans who were killed, 30 of them. President Reagan said, "You can run, but you can't hide." When Leon Klinghoffer run off the Achille Lauro cruise ship,
Right.
F-14 Tomcats up and intercepted the plane that was carrying the Palestinian terrorists.
Which was a surgical approach, right? It was a surgical, precise, definitive, deliberate chase of the culprits, right?
Absolutely, and that's why I called for on day one when we knew there were American hostages. I called on day one for Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 to be deployed to work with the Israelis to rescue our hostages. Now we're finding out that probably 100 of the 130 hostages are dead. You know, the Hamas says they can only account for 30 of the people that were taken. Totally unacceptable. So, you know, we got to stop dealing with Hamas as an NGO or some sort of government, legitimate government. This is a terrible, terrible terrorist organization. They're a caliphate, which is like the ISIS caliphate, needs to be destroyed. The hostages need to be rescued, and the leaders of Hamas need to be put in jail. And only then can we have go back to what we wanted was a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine. Not from the river to the sea where the Jews are sent back to Poland, which is what's being called for now, but a real two-state solution where there can be peace and prosperity and happiness between the Palestinian people. And look, I decry the deaths.
So you believe that is still doable?
It's a heck of a lot harder than it was before now. I mean, that's for sure. And people have been radicalized. And if you're an Israeli, why would you trust a two-state solution? And the Palestinians have corrupt leaders and terrorist leaders. And so, you know, hopefully the region will get involved, and the moderate Gulf monarchies will get involved, and Egypt will get involved, and we can do something for the Palestinian people and get them a real state of their own.
Well, look, we just have a few minutes left, unfortunately, because this is a fascinating conversation. But we are listening to you right now in Doha, in Qatar. Qatar is hosts America's largest base in the Middle East, and you have had a long and deep relationship with Qataris. Qatar also has been playing a key role as an intermediary in negotiating with Hamas and hosts some elements of the political wing of Hamas in there. How would you reconcile? What counsel would you give our friends in Qatar? And how do you see Qatar at this moment engaged in this sort of interesting set of, it's not even a triangle, maybe it's an octagon of the different relationships that are involved here, that Qatar is involved in a number of them. How would you both applaud and critique that role?
Well, listen, the first thing I'd say about Qatar is I want to thank them for hosting our airmen and Marines, and soldiers and sailors. They do a great job. They burden share with us. They treat our people very well. I've always had a great relationship, both when I was hostage envoy, Steve, and also when I was national security advisor with Sheikh Mohammed, the prime minister and foreign minister, with the emir, with the ambassador, Michel Al-Thani.
Sure.
Very, very solid diplomats. Qatar punches above its weight. They helped us get hostages home in the past. They've gotten us intelligence on hostages that's allowed us to rescue them. And so I want to
remind our audience, you were our special envoy for hostages too. And so that was a very key role that you played for the last administration and in the State Department.
No, thank you. And Qatar was always a good partner. And so, look, but now they're playing this role of a mediator. And look, when you're a mediator or an arbitrator, I've been an arbitrator and a mediator for most of my career, and in legal issues, in civil cases in America. And you never make anyone happy as the neutral.
No one loves the mediator.
It's hard to deliver a message from both sides, and sometimes a mediator gets confused with the message they're delivering from one side or the other. So, look, I think people appreciate the role that Qatar's playing as an honest broker. I think when it's over, that I'm sure they'll probably reconsider whether they want the political wing of Hamas there. Probably not a good idea, because I think they'll probably end up in Tehran or maybe Ankara, but. I think our Qatarese friends have always been a good part. Look, they're in a tough neighborhood. They're a small country in a tough neighborhood. They punch above their weight, and they've always been a good partner for the United States. I hope that continues.
Right.
And my friends in Qatar well.
Let me ask you one last quick question. I was with a conference the other day, a National Security Forum, with a really, high-level, good group of Saudi participants, and there was a kind of, I hate to call it this, but a kind of smugness, a kind of confidence that if President Trump returned, that the U.S.-Saudi relationship was going to be great. I happened to do a lot of reporting around the time when President Rouhani was in place that actually the Trump administration was very interested in getting rid of the JCPOA, but cutting a better deal. And I mentioned at this conference, believe me, if President Trump can get a better deal with the Iranians, it's gonna happen. Like the biggest mistake you can make with President Trump is predicting consistency if there's an opportunity for a deal. Tell me where I'm wrong. Do you see any possibility that Donald Trump, like Nixon going China, Trump could go to Iran?
Well, first of all, we had a great relationship with the Saudis, and it's too bad that they haven't joined the Abraham Accords yet. I think if we'd been reelected, that they would have very quickly. And I don't think the Abraham Accords would have happened without the Saudis behind the scenes allowing Bahrain and UAE to break and Morocco to enter those accords. So Saudi played a very constructive role. I think they continue to do it in the Middle East. As far as Iran goes, look, we had Iran in a box. They were down to $4 billion in foreign currency reserves. They couldn't sell oil. They were down to 300,000 barrels a day on the black market. If we'd been reelected, the Iranians would have been begging for a deal. And there were indications that they wanted to deal through third-party governments who were telling us they wanted to deal. But they wanted to wait out the election and see what happened. And when President Trump lost and they moved back to appeasement and, quote, de-escalation, which is the new Democrat word for appeasement, and a blind eye be turned to sanctions, why should they engage in good faith negotiations? I mean, we paid $6 billion for 4 hostages and gave them $200 billion in sanctions relief. So there was no real incentive for the Iranians at any point to enter into a serious negotiation over their nuclear capability. But if Trump comes back in and the screws get tightened, I think you could very easily see a deal happen.
Well, you heard it here, folks. Ambassador Robert O'Brien, I always appreciate your candor and answering my questions very directly. Thank you so much for joining us at the Global Security Forum. Sorry you're not with us in Doha. I'm having a great time here, and I look forward to seeing you again, my friend. Thank you so much.
Great to be with you, Steve. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that was Ambassador Robert O'Brien. I just want us to all to give a round of applause to the simultaneous translators, because that must have been the toughest session for translation in the entire conference. So, big round to all of you. Thank you very much.